Thank you very much, Johan. It's really great to be here and pretty terrifying to follow an introduction in terms of the sociological imagination, but I shall do my best. What I'm going to do, the demand programme, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that and then get straight in to some basically a range of puzzles, some topics that we're thinking about within demand that I could do with some help from you in thinking about. So this isn't a kind of finished programme of work. It's like, oh, now what we do, kind of set of questions, but with a little bit more emphasis than just the, I don't know what we're doing kind of thing. But first, and to provide a bit more context for those who don't know at all, this is a list of people who are involved in this project that I'm mostly going to be talking about. But before I get going, I thought it would be handy to say something. Demand is one of the 6 centres. Steve's looking after another one. And our centre, we say, is really distinctive in fully taking on board kind of social science questions of what is energy for? What is demand? How is it made? So our 3 propositions across the top. The first is that energy is used, not for its own sake, not just randomly or anything, but it's used in the course of accomplishing social practices. So if you're interested in what energy is for, you should then be interested in what people are doing in social practices broadly defined, and also in the basic recognition that social practices are not disconnected from the material infrastructures and hardware of the world around us and institutions. And so, in a way, from energy demand, you need to understand the range, what is office working, what is home life, all sorts of different areas, plus how they're bedded into and co-constitutive of infrastructures, and how that combination over time generates and reproduces and challenges certain understandings of what is normal in daily life and how much energy therefore follows to maintain that version of normality and entitlement. So we've got these 5 themes represented by these different coloured blocks. The first one, pretty briefly, is about more secondary analysis, about data on how and why end-use practices change. The second consists of a collection of projects that are going into some areas of daily life we know that are changing. So, for example, home IT, or, for example, mobile, elderly. Not all of them are necessarily huge areas of energy demand, but they're changing in ways that matter for practices and then perhaps sometimes a bit more indirectly for energy demand. The theme 3, with the blocks on, that's the context for the project that I'm going to talk about more. But it's basically recognising that infrastructures and institutions do shape practices demand. The question is how, and how is that changing? The 4th is about normality and need, and the 5th sort of Tetris thing at the bottom is indeed Tetris. It's about how we fit the pieces together. But our basic proposition, and it's a big programme, 5 years and lots of projects, 9 universities, 15 co-Is, that kind of thing, is that within all of that we can identify opportunities for kind of demand management, broadly defined at different scales. We can think of how energy demand kind of happens. We're dealing with transport, we're dealing with non-domestic energy, we're dealing with domestic energy. Thinking about kind of how processes of demand, by which we mean modifying the practices that underpin demand. Can they be steered and changed? So the basic thing is, what is energy for? And in that we're really sticking to our guns on that. Here's just a list. Again, this is a catalogue to kind of spell out or give a bit more detail to the types of projects that constitute this programme. So, for example, we're looking at how needs and expectations in theme 3 are negotiated in commercial office buildings, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the idea there is that what an office is connects how big it is, how much space, how many desks, how much power, how much lighting, how much heating, how much cooling, relates quite closely to an understanding of office work and office life. That's just one example. Anyway, we've got some really nice postcards, which I've got some upstairs of, which kind of go through this kind of detail if you're interested. But that just gives you a sense of the scale of the project. Now to the business. As I've said, our basic proposition is that energy isn't used for its own sake, but is used in the course of accomplishing social practices. What people do matters for energy demand, and technologies and infrastructures also obviously matter both for energy demand and for what people do. That I think we can definitely agree on. And therefore, if we're interested in demand, we need some ideas about how these different parts connect and how they add up. I put it here, how do technologies, infrastructures and practices interact? And you could say, well, that's not a problem. I mean, actually, there's lots of work gone on at SPRU, there's lots of histories of technology, there's lots of histories and science. So you can just turn to that and answer these questions. But my kind of puzzle really is that I'm not sure that's true. And in particular, I'm not sure that's true in thinking about what I'm calling infrastructures. But before I kind of arrive at that, I'll run through some already very established, I mean, they're represented in slightly simple terms here, and slightly simple little icons, but some established positions for thinking about technology, users, and behaviour. And so in a lot of the energy and energy discussions, Michael Grubb's talk last night, for example, was about technology on the one side and user behaviour on the other, and a lot of kind of notions of non-technical barriers and energy efficiency technologies would find their way into practice if only this block in the middle between the square of the technology and the round of the behaviour, if only they could sort of burrow through that or get round that, then lots of things would be better. And there's lots of advice and there are lots of ideas that social science can kind of help the burrowing around that block in the middle. The second kind of way of thinking about that is to say, well, actually, that's not a block. Actually, that if you swivel that barrier around, it's a connector, or it's more about understanding, not separating technology from behaviour, but thinking of socio-technical configurations, paying close attention, as Sharon mentioned, to the users and technology and how they get on with each other. And there's a huge literature on that. But certainly for me, and to some extent for demand, what's missing from those ways of thinking about technology and behaviour is actually, in a way, the question, what is energy for? Is what are the practices that sort of are part of both technology and behaviour? And so this three-colour scheme, very sort of basic primary colour scheme, picks up the argument that social practices, office working, having a daily shower, those kinds of things, are active integrations of materials, which is represented by the blue blob, of kind of meanings and understandings. It's normal to do this, or you get fresh, or it's about hygiene or cleanliness or things with the showering, and a kind of set of competence, skill and understanding. And so the argument is that social practice is an integration of those. And I think that's a different, the point of entry is the practice, not either the technology or the behaviour. And if you carry on, if you get carried away with the kind of beautiful colours, the primary elements of the social world, then you can have all sorts of diagrams which begin to explore, and I have done this kind of before, and take further the idea that social practices consist of integrations of elements. You can say, for example, here, how does an idea of freshness, which might be here, hold together the laundry, like the washing machine, but also the shower? Different skills, but there's something, shared meaning, or shared meanings of westernisation, or youth, or whatever. So these are deliberately abstract kind of schemes because they enable you to think through the types of elements. You have to recognise at the top that each kind of integration of elements changes, so competence changes as you become more skilled in some kind of practice. You have to recognise that something like digital photography took hold of a lot of skills that were already established in photography but transformed them. So we're not talking about fixed elements that stay solid in some way. There's a constant dynamic mutation going on there, and you know, understanding like the invention of Nordic walking, which we've written about, is partly about companies providing the sticks, but the sticks alone won't work. They have to be picked up and mobilised and fed into a new version of doing walking, new kind of exercise before any of this happens. And so it's been great fun working with these ideas, and I think it's a kind of challenge to some of the actor network theory ideas, and so you know, it's not just, but a lot of this writing, including mine and other people's, has been about like the idea of an object, of an individual, like the Nordic walking stick or a toaster or a shower or whatever. What we haven't yet done is use anything like these ideas to begin to think about the dynamics of practices and something like water in general, or electricity in general, or petrol in general, In other words, when you start thinking about those issues, this scheme, well, you've got to do more, basically, if you want to hang on to these ideas about the role of not just materials, not just objects, but maybe material arrangements or infrastructure. Something else has to happen. And also, I think, and I'll say more, that if we start getting into conceptualizing infrastructures, we have to think about not one practice at a time, but many practices at a time. Heating systems make an environment in which, like an office environment, in which many different things go on. So we need to extend these notions of sets and collective sets of practices. Anyway, this has led us to think that thinking about infrastructures is a sort of new, it's not a new challenge entirely, but actually there's not many very good ideas for thinking en masse about how sets of technologies intersect and constitute these broader enabling systems. So this list is not an exercise in defining an infrastructure, because I think to do that is a bit of a silly pursuit, but it's beginning to identify some things to think about when dealing with topics about the kind of linking of systems together. So the kind of idea that I'm going to take forward is that these material arrangements, roughly called infrastructures, they're kind of limit and are co-constituted by the enactment of many social practices. No, an electricity grid doesn't depend on just showering or just heating. Actually, the kind of ongoing functioning of the system depends on many practices happening in many different locations. The systems I'm interested in are collective and connective. They're somewhat shared across people. They certainly enable many practices. They're often, but not always, they have kind of professionals involved. There are designers, there are planners, there are transport engineers, these kinds of things. They're relatively, maybe not all of them do, there's lots of temporary infrastructures, but some of them last for quite a long time, and that's a feature. Anyway, you can see this sort of thing. Then we were doing this list, and we think, well, there are still some problems, like is a building an infrastructure, or is it a place where infrastructures come together? There isn't one answer, we're not interested in one, but we're beginning, thinking about those junctions and connections is what that exercise begins to do. And again, I think there's plenty of good, Thomas Hughes' work is absolutely fantastic on the building of a kind of electrical systems and the practices that go with it. But it sort of stops a bit short of then following through the multiple practices that enables. And it follows a bit short in dealing with only electricity and not with water as well, and not with the other broadband and the other kinds of systems. So we figure we're on the edge of some kind of agenda here. And I'm going to just elaborate a bit on some of the features. One is obviously that infrastructure, like this is the UK grid, enables many practices at once and depends on them. If they weren't all being enacted, it wouldn't be like it is. It wouldn't function in the way that it is. We know that many devices and in a way infrastructure, so supply and demand are quite closely, they kind of constitute each other in a somewhat distinctive way. In the very early days of building the electricity grid, then actually like making a cup of tea or boiling water was part like making an electric kettle, was an important part of building the need for electricity, which hadn't existed there before. So there's a direct connection between establishing both the kind of broader infrastructure and the technologies that plug into it, in this case a kettle, and the kinds of ways of using electricity. So I'm quite interested in how practices change as they become electrified, which is another way of thinking about that sort of process. Obviously, there are much bigger kind of investment issues about how big supply should be, which connects to how many and what kinds of practices and when connect to that form of supply. We're talking in fairly general terms because I'm interested also in keeping in view the kind of transport plus the energy and thinking about the similarities and differences there. Obviously this is a kettle, but other examples aren't. It's completely obvious that when you start thinking about this kind of systems of practices, technologies and infrastructures, you need to remember in a way the many forms of connection. This is a nice picture by Greg Wallenborn, and it sort of reminds you that there's power stations and then there's manufacturers of white goods, and then there are different kinds of retailers and different kinds of production, and then they actually, the white goods end up in a home at the bottom, and there are people doing different things in the different rooms of the home. So this kind of fragmentation and specialisation of the system still kind of comes together in the doings of certain practices sort of on the ground, and in a way all of those parts keep the other parts alive in a certain way. So that's more about systems and infrastructures and technologies. I think another really important issue for thinking about energy demand in the way that we are is recognising the overlapping of multiple infrastructures, like running water and kind of heating go together to make a functioning shower. Lots of others hang together in a way, and the histories tend to be one at a time and not all together. But not always. So these are kind of, if you interrogate particular locations, this is Road Junction, or taking the surface of the road off in Broadway, you can see the sewers and you can see the pipes and the wiring as they are co-located. But of course we live with Victorian infrastructure. It's not that they were built in any coherent or systematic way or at any one point in time. These systems have been layered on top of each other. So any particular location, or pretty much anywhere else, is going to have some funny kind of combination, but not the same combination. This raises further questions, I think, about like the endurance of infrastructures even beyond when the practices for which they were designed have long gone, and I'll come back to some of that. But also it's clear that the kind of dynamics of practice and the dynamics of infrastructure, though connected, are obviously not the same. Otherwise, like every location would be doing, be lots of different things. So something about the adaptability of practice, they can get by with not identical and not fully appropriate anyway. There's some flex in that space, which is really important if we're interested in following through the technologies, infrastructures, practices, demand kind of thing. The transport thing, we've got some really nice and really good people working on transport in demand, and but I'm not one of them, so I come more from that sort of thing. When we have those sorts of conversations and say what's infrastructure, then it gets instantly rather, they're all tricky, but it's sort of obviously tricky here. We're interested in something like shopping or going to school or going for a walk in the countryside. The kind of, the car, in this case, car dependent. Are these car dependent practices? When they need the car needs some fuel, but also, and it needs some roads to go along, because none of this is going to work without all these pieces, and some kinds of destinations which are car reachable. So where are we going to cut? I mean, does it matter where we cut the system? But obviously thinking about car dependence and infrastructures, you only think about the roads. That's the main point there. You need these other parts of that to understand anything about the development of car-dependent practices. And I think the idea of car-dependent practices is interesting. In the kind of transport literature, the idea of car dependence, very much the same with energy, is that a person is dependent on the car. Like you get the sort of, car poverty, as it were, or people who depend on a car who don't have one, their issues of access. Or a place, like Los Angeles, depends on cars. But in thinking about which practices depend on cars, we've got more room, more space to kind of understand the dynamic processes that intersect there. So we haven't got very far with that, but there's some big questions come up. And I think those questions also remind us and bring us back to thinking about the spatial with infrastructures and technologies, and partly the tendency to focus on specific devices is somewhat detached from the spatial aspect of material innovation, but infrastructures bring you very much closer to that. So here's a kind of sketch scheme. The top line here shows the kind of material elements that you might need for conducting practice A, and they exist. They correspond at that location. But so you could do part of practice A there, but not necessarily all of it. And so when you thinking about doing different practices, thinking about, I like the idea of this diagram. It's like a kind of combination lock or a kind of key. There needs to be some correspondence between the sort of requisite elements of the practice for that particular moment, for the way of doing, and the kind of material systems of provision at a particular location. And here's the same diagram, but recognising that multiple practices can require the same infrastructure, and different practices sometimes need separate bits of infrastructure. The point is really to remember the spatial, which then becomes really important for us. This is now where we're beginning to think about a kind of method within demand that can capture these sorts of, like empirical method. We're still grappling, struggling, flailing in a way, theoretically, but empirically we have some ideas that actually looking at the kind of changing, the black blocks represent a practice which is disappearing between the kind of 1920 and 2020, and the kind of orange blocks there show a practice which is coming and then disappearing, and the grey show a kind of fluctuate. It doesn't fully matter what they are. The infrastructures blocks show you where, so yellow might be broadband, for example, although it's coming a bit late. The different kinds of sewage systems might be represented kind of grid. Anyway, you can get the idea that the different combinations of practices need to map on in different ways to different combinations of infrastructures over time. So you can look at a particular point in time and a particular location, but you can also do kinds of histories of practices where you see those kinds of chains of development. And the interesting thing is thinking about future combinations, both of practices and infrastructures. And I'm not going to talk about that because that certainly needs some more thinking about. That's a sort of sketch scheme to go from the ideas towards a method, but not yet a method. One of the practical kind of steps in this direction is to look at the development, really of houses, but in this case the kitchen. So we're working with Frank Trentman, who's a historian, and Anna Carlson-Hislop as well. And this is a picture of a normal kitchen provision in local authority housing in Stocksbridge, which is just outside Sheffield, in 1928. And in a way, written into this kitchen are certain ways of living, certain patterns, certain forms of cooking. Certainly the bath is in the kitchen, so you haven't got a separate bathroom. So there's some kind of integration of doing an infrastructure here. And the really great thing is that these houses are still there. So what we're interested in here is kind of following the internal adaptation and renewal, because lots of things, some amazingly, this is great, this is from Anna's kind of work in the archives, and this is from like property sales data available on the internet. It's the house in the same estate, and you can see the floor, you can see what bits of the floor plan have changed. This is really basic, it's just the floor plan. But what's happened is the larder here has gone. And that's quite well documented. So what happens is you get a fridge and not a larder. And actually you get energy demand in a way that it's only one tiny little example, but it's about how the infrastructures of cooling or managing food have this kind of historical dynamic, but also in a way that draws more energy into the home, calls for more energy where it didn't exist before. There's some really great stuff that Anna, I mean, like, when you first got a fridge in this local authority setting and you wanted to demolish the larder, you had to apply for permission because it was rental property. But actually you had to leave the fridge there when you left. The fridge was part of the infrastructure of the home because it was replacing the larder, which was part of the infrastructure of the home. So there's some also very intriguing things about ownership and systems of provision across this. Where does change happen in this technology infrastructures interface? So we will, haven't yet, actually go and knock on the doors of these properties and find out what other kinds of changes have gone on. But again, just from property details, following the same house, the top one is one of the Stocksbridge kitchens today, and you can sort of see, obviously it's not got the bath in there, minimum you can see that. The bottom one is, I mean, I don't particularly like it, in fact I don't like it at all, but it's not exactly an exceptional looking kind of kitchen. But what is more intriguing is when you look, this is the plan of the points of opportunity to use electricity. And there's just loads of them. I mean, lighting and power supply. It's not that everything is plugged in all the time, but in as far as the kind of... So there's something about the... I mean, you can imagine with energy demand, and like we're social scientists, so people think we're talking about behaviour. And we're trying to say, well, hang on, no, this is the stuff that we're actually interested in. And what I think one of the further things is really key is this kind of renewal and adaptation, the fixity and the flexibility of infrastructures and technologies and the relations to practices. And demand is great because it's got so many different parts to it, including the potential to think about these sorts of processes in homes and the parallels and differences within the commercial office sector. So you kind of got to go zoop into another world. The kind of history of standards, the standard specification for rental office space, kind of changes radically over the last 50, 60 years. And here's a list. So there's also something, I mean, some of you may not know, but a lot of offices, they're kind of built and developed in this shell and core and the kind of fit-out sort of way. So a developer will produce something that's not much more like an office than this. It's got the potential to heat and cool, actually, and it's got lots of power, but anything that makes it an office of a particular company or anything like that is not there. And that's because the kind of, the idea is that that will change frequently. Tenants will move in and out, and so they need to strip it out. So this is really the office. So if you occupy this for 6 years, you've got to return it to this condition. That's how the leasing and rental system work. Some very, very strong forms of kind of energy demand built into that kind of way, the method of working, but also therefore into the infrastructure itself. So this infrastructure is sized for any potential future imaginable tenant, i.e. oversized, I mean radically oversized, because it has to be, because that's part of the way this system of provision functions. And so here's just a list of the many things that are provided now as normal, not because they are necessarily normal, but because they are normal in the letting sense, not necessarily connected to the actual use. So here, I think this is again a very sort of the idea of the shell and the core kind of thing. There's some different things that we have to think about in thinking about infrastructures and practices, which is something about governance of them, which is something about, well, yeah, systems of provision and ownership. You can't ignore that. But also thinking about the mechanism or the routes through which standard specifications come to be. So we'll be working with the British Council for Offices on this, and thinking about when and how are they contested. So we've done a lot of work before on the indoor climate and like why it is 22 degrees C as a kind of standard and how that comes to be. And that's a massive energy demanding kind of force all over. So that's sort of part of it. And I think we want very much to connect this also to, like, these standards don't come from kind of nowhere, and they are about the meaning of office work. And so we're keen to kind of hang on to that changing understanding of what it is to be an office worker and what an office is and how that kind of articulates and standardises. I mean, I think that's the standardisation will be quite key here, along with this sort of renewal. And it's like an onion skin. Parts of it are changed very rapidly and other parts aren't. We need to think about how the layers of the onion skin work together in this infrastructure technology thing. Now then, and again I think you can tell, even I can tell as I'm speaking, that this traffic and transport thing has some similarities but also differences in how we conceptualise infrastructures and what flows through infrastructures. So I've been arguing with Greg a bit about kind of electrons and cars and whether we could think of the wires as the sort of infrastructure like the roads and these cars that are jiggling there. So there's something about units and like how do you actually conceptualise these kinds of systems. And one thing which is interesting is with cars, you can get real traffic jams. And so the system stops functioning. With electricity on the whole, they just make more. But, so the peak load is not quite, meaning of peak is not the same. This picture at the top is a temporal and spatial representation of peak load in London in the charging zone. So the red is where there's lots of traffic and blue at different times of day and so the red moves around, it doesn't stay the same. So here, the way the infrastructure is used is part of the infrastructure itself. If you think of London as an infrastructure, it's a living system. The properties of that map at the top are changing all the time. And that's sort of, well, we're having to think a bit about how to conceptualise that. But I think there are some things, as we suggested with the picture before, about destinations kind of needing to factor into how you think about transport infrastructure, as well as the spatial and temporal. So there's a lot more to do there. There's also a lot more. So I picked on the car dependence partly because it's sort of easy-ish to imagine and describe, and there's a literature on that. But if in thinking about mobility and infrastructures, cars aren't the only way to go, and bicycles also exist, and roads are used by cars and bikes, and there's lots of sort of Other matters to consider in terms of the layering, not just like a shower where you've got electricity and water, but where a road where you've got multiple kinds of users and units flowing along it at the same time. But this is a picture of Stevenage, which was built with miles and miles of cycleways. And I think this is an important point. That was there to enable cycling, which actually, it's a bit like the Nordic walking sticks. The cycleways are there, but the cyclists aren't. So here's where a very strong, very important point for a lot of energy planning, actually, that the infrastructure doesn't constitute demand in its own right. But also the relationship between cycling and driving. So there's still mobility, but it's of different forms, and one has kind of implications for the other. That's the point there. And that similar point about layering new material arrangements and practices on top of old ones is relevant for thinking about what electric cars are and electric driving, because obviously it's a car and it's on a road, but it's kind of taking from another infrastructure in terms of the kind of power here. So there's something. So we're interested in concepts like adaptation and augmentation and layering and things that we haven't, like there isn't a dictionary of kind of ideas that you can use here, but we're sort of trying to work on that. Also, as I say, recognising that infrastructures in this case are shared by lots of different sorts of practices and sorts of elements that are flowing along if the road is the kind of like the wire. But it's not just that. They are, in fact, in competition with each other. I mean, space given to one is space not given to another. So there's something also about infrastructures which is different to a material element of a practice, which it's just there. Because these are connective and collective, they're actually sites of battle, if you like, between competing practices for their use. Don't quite know how we're going to think about that. But it's one useful set of resources to think about many of these topics, and this is a promissory note, I mean we haven't done this yet, is that there have been lots of efforts to design and plan infrastructure, and those efforts have made some pretty strong assumptions about how they would be or should be or ought to be used. So one thing we can do is find out what those assumptions are and kind of unpick the story from that side. So we will be looking at Stevenage's master plan and at the kind of ways of family life that were written into Stevenage and how Stevenage is inhabited now. The kind of undoing infrastructure is at least, if not more, interesting. There's a map there of the sort of railway network before and after beaching, which shows how many railway lines were removed. But it's also a reminder that it's not the railway line, because they may not have been used very much. So what is it that's being removed? There's something complicated there. And the other one about how the very durable, very short-lived for freight, but nonetheless long-lived for other purposes, infrastructure of the canal systems kind of gets modified and adapted. We're not doing loads of work on canals, but these questions, I'm still really struggling. That's why I've come here to talk to you, to kind of get the scale of intellectual resources to capture this set of processes. So this is kind of to finish. These are what were some of the challenges that we think we're confronted with. We do really like the ideas of the kind of dynamics of social practices, and we know that the material is embedded in that and these kinds of things. We know that those sorts of dynamics are really important for energy, like automation and cooling, and more being delegated to electricity, human labour being delegated to electricity. We know that there are lots and lots of appliances and forms of travel which are about speed, and we know that's really important for the range of practices conducted in daily life and for how they go. And we know quite a lot of things that are really important. We know that those sorts of changes on a societal scale of practices call for and are connected to these enabling and ordering infrastructures. And we know that energy demand is a consequence of those, but we're slightly still grappling with ways to better understand both the differences between the types of systems I've described, the kind of specific processes of feeding back. So, you know, the grid does depend on all of us as consumers. It wouldn't work otherwise. We're interested in this kind of infrastructure practice relations for what constitutes, how the kind of understanding of normal ways of living are built from those two together, not one alone and not the other alone. And as I say, things about technology and users just don't get anywhere near this range of stuff. It's not just the users by any stretch of the imagination, nor is it just investment in technology. We know that the kind of language, even Steve's Centre of Emergence, Diffusion and Impact, somehow is missing these kind of processes of ongoing, overlapping, intersecting, normal making that are happening at this cumulative kind of level. And we know that just focusing on the life of one practice at a time won't work. So, so help. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Time for questions. Please.
I'm not very informed about these 6 projects in the bid C.
Yeah.
Forgive me if everyone else in the room is already familiar with the answer to this question, but I was wondering how the normative aims of the demand project or central, whatever you want to call it, are framed. I mean, is it just about energy reduction or sustainability or lifestyles, or I'm just wondering.
There'd be one really simple answer from the call for proposals, which is it's about carbon reduction.
Okay. Yeah, that was the thing I thought maybe everyone else in the room might know.
Yeah.
And what then are the implications of that framing? I mean, how do you feel about constraints in some ways, what you're able to do?
Not very.
Okay.
Largely because our proposition is that we need to understand relevant processes of change. So, for example, one of the projects is on home IT. Well, I mean, yes, it's an area which has grown massively, and there are some things about big televisions that are taking more. But compared with home heating, it's like tiny in terms of the carbon emissions sort of story. But that hasn't stopped us looking at it, because our argument is the kinds of dynamics and processes that we can see in that field are actually, well, first of all, they're probably not separate from where people are, and they're part of this bigger story. So we've taken a very enjoyably generous interpretation of that challenge.
Another benefit of practices approach.
You could say.